Slavery, an institution deeply rooted in oppression and injustice, has had a profound and enduring impact on the lives of black people. During this period of slavery, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands, transported across the Atlantic, and enslaved in the Americas. Slavery originated during the colonial era and persisted through to the antebellum period in American history, during which enslaved Africans and their descendants endured unimaginable suffering, enduring physical and psychological abuse, family separation, and the harsh realities of bondage. They endured extreme hardships, including brutal labor on plantations and the denial of basic human rights. The word antebellum is derived from Latin roots. Ante means before, and bellum means war. Therefore, antebellum literally translates to before the war. In the context of American history, the term antebellum typically refers to the period preceding the American Civil War. Specifically, the years leading up to the war, from the late 18th century to the year 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War. The antebellum era is commonly used to describe this period because it captures the distinct social, economic, and cultural characteristics that defined the years leading to the conflict and division that resulted to the Civil War in the United States. It symbolizes the economic growth and rapid industrialization in the North, contrasting with the agrarian-based plantation system in the South, signifying a specific historical period marked by intense debates and conflicts over issues such as slavery, states' rights, and the future of the nation. The antebellum South was indeed characterized by the use of slavery during the progression of this era. Southern intellectuals and leaders gradually shifted their portrayal and defense of slavery. They argued that slavery was necessary for the prosperity of the Southern economy, maintaining that it provided stability and efficiency in agricultural production. Some even contended that slavery was a positive institution, asserting that enslaved individuals were better off under the care and control of their white enslavers. And because of this, abolitionists who advocated for the immediate emancipation of enslaved individuals and the end of slavery faced harsh criticism and opposition by these leaders. The demand for slave labor and the U.S. ban on importing more slaves from Africa drove up prices for slaves, making it profitable for smaller farms in older settled areas such as Virginia to sell their slaves further south and west. Most farmers in the South had small to medium-sized farms with few slaves, but the large plantation owners' wealth, often reflected in the number of slaves they owned, afforded them considerable prestige and political power. During the antebellum era, the United States grappled with significant issues, including debates over states' rights and growing tensions between the North and the South. These issues were central to the political and social landscape of the time and contributed to the eventual outbreak of the Civil War, which had a profound and lasting impact on the country. While dehumanization of slaves during the antebellum period is extensively documented, with enough evidence on the various forms of abuse, including sexual relationships that ranged from non-consensual acts of rape to what may have been perceived as symbolic romantic partnerships between white slave masters and black women. However, a lesser-known aspect of this era involves the abuse experienced by black male slaves at the hands of elite white women, specifically those belonging to the planter class. Surprised, right? Yes, it did occur. The term planter class women refers to women who belong to the social and economic elite of the antebellum South. These women were typically married to plantation owners or members of the wealthy landowning class. Their husbands, known as planters, owned large agricultural estates, often specialized in cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, or rice, and relied heavily on enslaved labor to cultivate and harvest their crops. Before we delve into this thought-provoking content, we kindly ask you to engage with our video by hitting the like button and sharing it to help spread this eye-opening information. If you haven't already, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel. So, sit back, relax, and join us as we unravel the uncommon story of the planter class white women and the remarkable abuse suffered by black male slaves under their control. Let us embark on this journey together. The intersection of power and gender in the context of slavery reveals that the institution was not solely defined by racial subjugation but also reinforced gender hierarchies. Despite being constrained by societal expectations of femininity, planter-class women held significant power within the framework of slavery. These women played a role in overseeing and perpetuating the system of oppression. They had the ability to exert control and influence over enslaved individuals, both male and female, through a variety of means, including physical punishment, sexual exploitation, and the management of domestic labor. White women in the American South before the Civil War held power within their homes and on plantations. They had the authority to issue commands, give instructions, and enforce discipline over both enslaved individuals and their own household members. However, it is important to note that this power was primarily exercised within the domestic sphere and did not extend to the public or political realms. They were denied the right to vote and were generally excluded from participating in formal political processes. Moreover, upon marriage, their property and assets were then transferred to their husbands. But the one thing they had agency and power was in the realm of buying and selling enslaved individuals. In the book They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South with Stephanie Jones Rogers as author. The historian challenges the idea that white women were passive bystanders to the slave economy in the U.S., demonstrating their active participation in its structures of brutality and exploitation. In the past, historians had often based their conclusions about white women's role in slavery on the writings of a small subset of white Southern women. But Jones Rogers, an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, drew on a different source. Interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted during the Great Depression as part of the Federal Writers Project, an arm of the Works Progress Administration. These interviews, Jones Rogers writes, show that white girls were trained in slave ownership, discipline, and mastery sometimes from birth, even being given enslaved people as gifts when they were as young as 9 months old. White slave-holding parents trained their daughters how to be slave owners. Slave-holding parents and slave-holding family members gave girls enslaved people as gifts, for Christmas sometimes, when they turned 16 or when they turned 21. There are even accounts of slave-holding parents and family members giving white female infants enslaved people as their own. There is one particular instance of a case, in a court record, where a woman talks about how her grandfather gave her an enslaved person as her own when she was 9 months old. And just how could a 9-month-old baby know that she owned a slave if she was not told so? Apparently she has been schooled on the robes. She grew up knowing that some absolute authority over another had been bestowed over her. That she had some waiting property of her own in the form of a human being according to the book They Were Her Property, by Jones Rogers. It has been observed that such children grow up not even recognizing black slaves as fellow humans. These particular upbringings have significantly contributed to the development of individuals with strong racist and supremacist beliefs within societies. This mindset is deeply flawed and needs to be dismantled. We must address this mentality and work towards fostering a new mindset that recognizes and respects the equality of all individuals. Sexual exploitation. One distressing aspect of the abuse experienced by black male slaves at the hands of privileged white women was sexual exploitation. While the prevailing narrative often depicts white women as passive or innocent, there were instances where they actively engaged in non-consensual relationships and committed acts of rape. By exploiting their power and control over black male slaves, they perpetuated a cycle of sexual violence and degradation, further dehumanizing those who were already enslaved. One example of such cases can be found in the autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, by Harriet Jacobs. Jacobs, who was once a slave herself, describes how a plantation owner. They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. The relationship described by the author clearly depicts sexually predatory behavior. Harriet Jacobs confirms that such acts were not uncommon and cannot be considered consensual by any meaningful definition. In fact, they constitute sexual abuse, if not outright rape. This highlights how plantation mistresses and elite women, like their male counterparts, were able to exert control over and abuse their slaves. Another way in which white women were able to exercise sexual control over slaves was by threatening to accuse them of rape or attempted rape if they did not agree to sex. In doing this, elite white women used one of the primary instruments of patriarchal repression, the idea that they were weak and in need of white male protection, and by extension, in need of control and domination by white men to exercise racial control over slaves. Potential causes of sexual exploitation. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated. Perhaps, even if subconsciously, sexually exploiting slaves served as a way for these women to compensate for their lack of power in other areas of their lives. Planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands and lacked considerable sexual agency relative to men. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. This is not to excuse the actions of sexually abusive white women, nor is it to suggest that female sexual abuse of slave men would not have occurred had women enjoyed a higher status in society. However, just as slave-owning white women often took out their frustrations on slaves through excessive cruelty and violence, they probably also used sex as a means of domination and control in a society in which they were relatively powerless. Their freedom and mobility was severely limited. For example, they were generally not allowed to travel without an older male chaperone. Spousal abuse was often considered a legitimate method for men to control their wives during the antebellum era. Indeed, in private, many plantation women were unhappy with their lack of freedom and the expectation that they remain dutiful, obedient, pleasant, and cheerful while their husbands had affairs with or raped female slaves. Knowing that the mixed-race slave children who surrounded them were their husbands' offspring was both humiliating and heartbreaking. Historian Catherine Clinton, in 1982, made the assertion that if plantation mistresses could live above reproach, their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers could boast of the superiority of their civilization. She further goes ahead and terms them prisoners in disguise. Southern women, who generally married at a younger age than those in the North, not infrequently at 15 or 16 years old, were often left abandoned on plantations while their husbands traveled for business, pleasure, or military duty. The life of a plantation mistress was often lonely and sad. Physical abuse. By 1830, slavery was primarily located in the South, where it existed in many different forms. African Americans were enslaved on small farms, large plantations, in cities and towns, inside homes, out in the fields, and in industry and transportation. Though slavery had such a wide variety of faces, the underlying concepts were always the same. Slaves were considered property, and they were property because they were black. Their status as property was enforced by violence, actual or threatened. People, black and white, lived together within these parameters, and their lives together took many forms. Physical violence inflicted upon black male slaves was not limited to white male slaveholders. White women also actively participated in brutal acts against them. These acts included whipping, beating, and other forms of corporal punishment, resulting in lasting physical and psychological scars. An infamous example illustrating the extreme and horrifying extent of physical abuse towards black male and female slaves is the story of Madame Delphine LaLaurie. Madame LaLaurie thrashed her slaves, gagged their eyes out, punched holes in their heads, and left maggots to infest the openings. If you find it hard to believe or dismiss this as exaggeration, prepare yourself for the shocking truth about the actions of Marie Delphine LaLaurie, a slave owner from the 18th century. She subjected her slaves to unspeakable acts of cruelty and evil. On April 10, 1834, at the mansion at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter of New Orleans, Louisiana, a fire broke out. The neighbors rushed out to help, offering to pour water on the flames and help the family evacuate. However, upon arrival, they noticed something highly unusual, considering the societal norms of the 19th century elite. The woman of the house was attempting to rescue her valuable jewelry without the assistance of her enslaved individuals. Madame LaLaurie, the notable mistress of the house, alone. A mansion without slaves seemed shocking. When questioned about the whereabouts of her servants, she responded by telling others to mind their own business. Some found this response mysterious enough, while others claimed to have heard faint cries and screams coming from the attic. In any case, a brave individuals took it upon themselves to enter the house and search for the woman's slaves. However, when they opened the attic door, they suddenly paused in their tracks, some vomiting from the stench. The horrifying and twisted sight was impossible to bear. Everything was piled up there, displaying the complete madness and ugliness that one could only imagine from the depths of misery. What the interlopers had found was the torture chamber of Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie, consistently ranked as one of the most infamous serial killers in the world, right up there with the blood-drinking, cannibalistic 16th-century Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Báthory. The suspicions of the neighbors were finally confirmed. The truth behind the disappearance of all the LaLaurie slaves was now exposed for everyone to see. It was a display of brutal savagery. Heaps of corpses, organs, and limbs. Slaves pinned to tables or cramped in small cages. Metal bars with spikes were wrapped around the slaves' necks to prevent them from moving their heads, while others were placed in small cages. Their bones had been dismantled and reset to fit the confined spaces. Lunatic. Live bodies with their eyes gouged, fingernails torn out, ears hanging by shreds of skin, or their mouths filled with animal shit and sewn shut. People flayed of skin with festering wounds. Numerous accounts claim they found one woman whose skin had been peeled off in spirals to make her look like a caterpillar, another with her bones broken and reset so that she looked like a crab, and one more whose intestines had been torn out and knotted around the waist. Many of these victims, some claim there were up to 100, were supposedly still alive, putrid and starving. No other form of physical abuse has reached such extreme measures. Mistress LaLaurie became famous for the depraved brutalization of her slaves. Legend has it that a 70-year-old slave cook who had been chained to the stove by LaLaurie, yet was slowly starving to death as well, started the fire. On interrogating her, the woman actually admitted that she had caused the fire in order to commit suicide. Why had the elderly lady opted to end her life in this manner? Madame LaLaurie had threatened to take her to the top room. No one who went to the upper room ever returned, according to the cook. The lady had decided that it was better to die than suffer at the hands of Madame LaLaurie. Following this discovery, the top chamber was broken into in order to investigate the cook's assertions. And, without a doubt, the top room was hell on earth for the slaves who ended up there. Born on March 19, 1787 in then Spanish-ruled New Orleans as Marie Delphine McCarty, most of LaLaurie's life passed without any real indication of cruelty or evil. Despite rumors that slaves killed her parents, the mistress actually lived a fairly normal and privileged life. She was a major part of New Orleans high society, and beloved as a kind, gentle, and courteous figure. Her father was Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, originally Chevalier de McCarthy, whose father Barthélemy de McCarthy brought the family to New Orleans from Ireland around 1730, during the French colonial period. Her mother was Marie-Jeanne Larrabel, also known as the widow Lecomte, as her marriage to Louis B. McCarty was her second. Both of Delphine's parents were prominent in the town's European Creole community. Her uncle by marriage, Esteban Rodriguez Miro, was governor of the Spanish-American provinces of Louisiana and Florida during 1785 to 1791, and her cousin, Augustin de McCarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. LaLaurie married 3 times and had 5 children, whom she was said to attend to lovingly. Her first husband was a Spaniard named Don Ramón de López Villangulo, a caballero de la Royal de Carlos, a high-ranking Spanish officer. The pair had one child together, a daughter, before his untimely death in Havana while en route to Madrid. 4 years after Don Raymond's death, Delphine remarried, this time to a Frenchman named Jean Blanc. Blanc was a banker, lawyer, and legislator, and was almost as affluent in the community as Delphine's family had been. Together, they had 4 children, 3 daughters, and 1 son. After Jean Blanc passed away, Delphine married her third and final husband, a much younger doctor named Leonard Louis Nicolas Lalaurie. In 1831, Madame Lalaurie purchased a 3-story mansion at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter. Also, as many society women did at the time, kept slaves. Accounts of Delphine Lalaurie's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834 fluctuate. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1838 and recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claimed that slaves of Lalaurie were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched. However, in public appearances Lalaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and solicitous of the health of those enslaved. On 2 occasions, she has been reported to free 2 of her slaves according to court record. Jean-Louis in 1819 and de Vince in 1832. Funeral registers between 1830 and 1834 document the deaths of 12 slaves at the Royal Street Mansion, although the causes of death are not mentioned. Nevertheless, public rumors about Lalaurie's mistreatment of slaves on her property were sufficiently widespread that a local lawyer was dispatched to Royal Street to remind Lalaurie of the laws for the upkeep of slaves. During this visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by Lalaurie. Though subsequent to the visit of the lawyer, one of Lalaurie's neighbors saw an 12-year-old slave girl fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street Mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whip-wielding Lalaurie. 2 of the reports are on record as being true. 1. That a man was so scared of punishment that he threw himself out of a 3rd-story window, choosing to die rather than be subjected to Madame Lalaurie's torture. The other report concerned a 12-year-old slave girl named Leah in 1833. Leah was brushing Madame Lalaurie's hair. She unintentionally pulled a little too hard, causing Lalaurie to fly into a rage. The mistress chased the little slave girl with a whip until the giller fell of the roof of the house. This led to Leah's death. The incident led to an investigation of the Lalauries, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty as Leah's lifeless body was discovered in a whale with the assistance of witnesses who had seen Lalaurie burying the corpse of the young girl. She fined $300 by the authorities and forced to sell 9 of her slaves. These 9 enslaved people were bought back by the Lalauries through an intermediary relative, and returned to the Royal Street residence where she continued to dehumanize them until the night of the fire outbreak in the year 1834, 10th day of the month of April. Madame Lalaurie and her husband had fled by boat, leaving the butler who had also participated in the torture to face the wrath of the crowd who had stormed into her mansion charged by the insanity of her evil. Some historians believe that the death of Madame Lalaurie's family at the hands of slaves during the Haitian Rebellion triggered a deep darkness within her, ultimately consuming her entire personality. However, this does not excuse her abhorrent evil deeds. Although she was never formally charged, her reputation among the upper-class society was completely ruined. It is believed that she passed away in Paris in December 1842. Exploring the mistreatment of black male slaves by white women reveals a disturbing aspect of history that has often been overlooked or deliberately silenced. By confronting this painful reality, we challenge the conventional narratives surrounding slavery and deepen our understanding of the complex power dynamics at play. Recognizing these historical injustices is an important step towards building a more inclusive and equitable future. We would appreciate your thoughts on this matter in the comments section below, and please stay tuned for further extensive content on the abuse of black male slaves in the pre-Civil War era. It has been a pleasure to have you all with us throughout this video segment. Don't forget to show your support by hitting the like button in front of you, and be sure to share your thoughts by using the share button to raise awareness among your associates and friends. Also, remember to subscribe to stay connected with our channel. Thank you for your continued support, and we look forward to seeing you soon.